There are certain moments in life when you realize you've been living in a completely different reality than the one that actually exists. It's like thinking you're driving a brand new car, only to find out it's been held together with duct tape and a prayer. That was me. That was my marriage. And I had no idea until one Tuesday afternoon when I found something I wasn't supposed to. It all started with a business trip, or, as I would later call it, Margaret's grand alibi. Now, let me tell you something about Margaret. She has always had a flair for the dramatic. The kind of woman who could turn an overcooked steak into a Shakespearean tragedy. The kind who sighs theatrically when she's looking for her keys, just to make sure you understand how the universe is conspiring against her. But this time, her performance was Oscar-worthy. "David, you won't believe it," she said, pacing the living room like she was about to deliver the Gettysburg Address. "The conference in Chicago? They need me there for a full week. Can you believe that? A week. In Chicago. For a marketing conference. Now, listen, I don't claim to be an expert on the corporate world, but I'm pretty sure people in marketing don't need 7 days to learn how to sell overpriced candles, or whatever it is she does." But I nodded, like the supportive husband I was, and said, "Wow. A whole week. Will you be learning how to make billboards out of gold?" She didn't laugh. Margaret only laughed when other people were watching. "No, David, it's important. I have to go," she insisted, already packing a suitcase with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for people escaping a hostage situation. I didn't question it. I didn't even think twice about it. But, looking back, I should have known. Margaret never went anywhere for a full week. She left early Monday morning, kissing me on the cheek like a soldier heading off to war. By Tuesday afternoon, I had already settled into what I like to call single-man mode, which consisted of eating directly out of takeout containers and leaving my socks wherever I pleased. It was going great, until I got the email. See, I wasn't snooping. I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't even thinking about Margaret. I was just sitting at my desk, minding my own business, when an email popped up from the Valley Crest Country Club. Subject: "Thank you for your recent visit." Now, I don't belong to a country club. In fact, I actively avoid places where men named Chad talk about their golf swings. But there it was, an email thanking me for my recent visit and inviting me back for another round of exclusive relaxation. At first, I figured it was spam, but then I saw it. The name on the account, Margaret Miller. The email wasn't sent to me. It was sent to her. But because we shared an old email account that we never bothered to separate, it had ended up in my inbox. Margaret Miller, who was supposed to be in Chicago, had apparently been enjoying the exclusive pleasures of Valley Crest on Monday afternoon, which, for those keeping track, is the same Monday she left for the airport. Now, I consider myself a fairly rational man. I don't jump to conclusions. I don't assume the worst. But I do believe in one fundamental truth. If your wife is at a luxury country club when she's supposed to be in another state, something is deeply, profoundly wrong. So, I did what any normal, well-adjusted man would do. I called the country club. "Valley Crest, this is Lisa. How may I assist you?" "Hi, Lisa," I said, keeping my voice friendly. "I got an email about my wife's recent visit, and I just wanted to confirm some details. You know, for our records." There was a pause, followed by the sound of typing. "Yes, Mr. Miller. Your wife visited us on Monday afternoon. She had a couple spa treatment and lunch at the Bistro Lounge. Would you like me to book another session?" A couple spa treatment. Now, unless Margaret had suddenly become two people, this was officially a problem. I took a deep breath. And, who was the other person in the couple? More typing. "Oh, that would be Mr. Vincent Holloway." I stared at the wall. Vincent Holloway. The name didn't mean anything to me, but the fact that he existed at all meant everything. Lisa continued, unaware that she had just set off a chain reaction that would destroy my marriage. "Mr. Holloway is actually one of our platinum members. He and your wife had a lovely afternoon. They left together around 4. Would you like me to book something for you two next time?" I hung up. Now, let's take a moment to appreciate the absurdity of this situation. Margaret had fabricated an entire business trip. She had packed a suitcase, given me a dramatic farewell, and then spent the afternoon at a country club with a man named Vincent Holloway. And, as far as I could tell, she had planned to keep this little detail forever hidden. I could have confronted her right then. I could have called her, demanded an explanation, asked her who Vincent Holloway was and why she needed a couple spa treatment with him when she was supposed to be in Chicago. But I didn't. Because now, I was curious. Who was Vincent Holloway? And just how deep did this go? I grabbed my laptop, typed his name into Google, and hit enter. And that's when I realized this wasn't just an affair. This was so much worse. Sitting in front of my laptop, I stared at the name on the screen like it was supposed to explain everything. Vincent Holloway, the mysterious spa buddy, the man who had, apparently, spent Monday afternoon getting a luxurious rub-down with my wife while I was at work, blissfully unaware that my marriage had turned into an open mic night for betrayal. Now, I don't consider myself an expert in the world of extramarital activities, but something about this didn't add up. People have affairs in hotels, in secret apartments, in the back of SUVs, not in country clubs where their name gets printed on an invoice. Margaret wasn't reckless. She was meticulous, the kind of person who organizes the spices alphabetically and cross-references grocery lists with store layouts. If she was cheating, she wouldn't be doing it somewhere that sends email confirmations. So, either Margaret had suddenly lost the ability to cover her tracks, or this was something bigger. I took a deep breath and did what every sane person does when they want to know if their spouse is lying. I Googled him. The first hit was a LinkedIn profile. CEO, Holloway Financial Group, based right here, in our city. The kind of guy who probably owned multiple suits and had never eaten a gas station hot dog. He looked exactly like you'd expect. A professional photo with the classic rich guy smile. The one that says, I vacation in places you can't pronounce. Now, I've worked in finance long enough to know these people don't just casually exist in your life. They exist in penthouses, on yachts, and in places where normal people like me aren't invited. Which meant Margaret, a marketing manager for a company that sells customizable planners, had no business knowing someone like Vincent Holloway. Unless she wasn't just cheating. I clicked through more results. Press articles. Business awards. And then, buried halfway down the search page, I found something actually useful. A small blurb from a real estate website. Vincent Holloway purchases historic estate in city's most expensive neighborhood. And there it was. The address. I sat back, tapping my fingers against the desk. I didn't know what I was planning to do with this information, but there was something deeply unsettling about the idea that my wife, who had never once suggested we upgrade from our normal-sized house, was spending her Monday afternoons at the estate of a man who probably had chandeliers in his bathroom. So, I did what any man in my situation would do. I took the afternoon off work. I pulled up to the property 30 minutes later, and let me tell you, calling it a house would be like calling the Titanic a rowboat. Massive iron gates, a driveway long enough to qualify as a scenic route, and a house that looked like it had been stolen from European royalty and plopped right here in the middle of people who shop at Whole Foods without looking at price tags. This was not the kind of place you casually drop by to catch up. I parked across the street and watched, because that's what my life had become now. Sitting outside a mansion, waiting to see if my wife waltzed out like it was her summer home. Nothing happened for a while. Just a few landscapers who looked like they were getting paid more than I was. And then, just when I was about to feel like an absolute moron for driving out here, something happened that made my stomach drop. A moving truck. A very specific moving truck. Our moving truck. Well, not ours in the traditional sense. But it was from the same company that had moved us into our house 5 years ago. The same logo, the same branding. And as I watched, my wife walked out of that house, carrying a box. Now, I would love to say that I handled this moment with the calm, rational mindset of a man who respects logic and reason. But in reality, my brain just started flashing error messages. Because what was happening here? Margaret wasn't visiting Vincent Holloway. She was moving something in. For the next hour, I sat there watching my wife make multiple trips into a house that wasn't ours, carrying box after box like she was setting up shop in the Holloway estate. And that's when I knew. This wasn't just an affair. Margaret was involved in something, and I was about to find out what. Now, at this point, a smarter man might have gone home and waited for his wife to return so he could confront her like a normal person. But I'm not a smarter man. I'm a man who had just spent an hour watching his wife move mystery boxes into a stranger's mansion, and I wasn't about to let that go unexamined. So, instead of doing the logical thing, I waited until she left, pulled my car around the corner, and walked right up to the moving crew. "Hey," I said, as casually as a man trespassing on someone's property can. "Just curious, what's all this stuff being moved in?" One of the movers, a guy with absolutely no interest in the concept of confidentiality, shrugged. "No idea, man. Just moving whatever's on the order." I nodded, like that was a normal answer, and then casually tilted my head toward the truck. "You mind if I take a look?" And this is the part where I remind you, sometimes, fate rewards stupidity, because the guy just shrugged. "Go for it, dude." So, I did. And I wish I hadn't, because inside the truck, half the boxes had my name on them. Not Margaret's. Not Vincent Holloway's. Mine. I picked up the first one, ripped the tape off, and pulled back the cardboard flap. And that's when I realized. Margaret hadn't been moving in. She had been moving out. I stood there, staring into the back of the moving truck like a man who had just found his own name on a tombstone. Boxes. Labeled with my name. Not ours. Mine. If I had any lingering doubt that Margaret had lost her mind, this pretty much sealed it. My wife, who was supposed to be at a business conference in Chicago, had been secretly moving my stuff into a mansion owned by a man I'd never met. I picked up the nearest box, ripped it open, and immediately recognized my books. Not just any books. The ones from my office. Now, let me clarify something. Margaret hates my office. She calls it the hoarder's den. She once suggested that we accidentally leave the window open during a storm so nature could handle the mess. The idea that she voluntarily packed up my books, which she had spent years trying to get me to throw away, was downright insane. So now I had two options. Accept that my wife had suffered a complete mental collapse and had started randomly shipping my possessions into the home of a wealthy stranger. Accept the more likely reality that I was being kicked out of my own marriage and nobody had bothered to tell me. I grabbed another box. More of my things. Old college yearbooks, framed photos that had been in the hallway for years. I moved to the next one, my winter clothes. The next, my tools. And then, the real kicker, a folder. A folder with my name on it. I opened it and found a lease agreement. For an apartment. My name was typed neatly at the top, along with an address I didn't recognize. The deposit had already been paid. The lease started next week. Next week. I stood there, holding the paper, feeling like I had just walked into an episode of a reality show where the twist is your wife is replacing you and hoped you wouldn't notice. This was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. This wasn't some heat-of-the-moment affair with a dramatic confession at the end. Margaret had planned this. She had signed an apartment lease under my name. She had arranged for my belongings to be packed up. She had hired movers to get me out of the house, while I was still living in it. And yet, she still came home every night, acted normal, kissed me goodbye, and pretended like none of this was happening. That's when it hit me. Margaret wasn't leaving me. She was making me leave her. Without a conversation. Without an argument. Without a single warning. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that lease, but at some point, one of the movers, clearly tired of my silent existential crisis, cleared his throat. You okay, man?" "Oh, I was fantastic. My wife was trying to evict me from my own life, and I had just found out by accident." I folded the lease, tucked it into my jacket, and turned back to the mover. "Hey," I said, as casually as I could. "Who hired you guys?" He checked his clipboard. "Some guy named Holloway. Paid in full up front." I nodded slowly, as if this was the most reasonable answer in the world. Of course. Vincent Holloway had paid to move me out of my own house, and Margaret had let him. I gave the movers one last glance before walking back to my car, getting in, and sitting there in absolute silence. I had everything I needed. Margaret wasn't just cheating on me. She was actively, strategically, and financially removing me from my own home. She didn't want a messy divorce. She didn't want an argument. She didn't want to fight over assets. She just wanted me gone. And she thought I would never notice. I pulled out my phone, scrolled to her name, and hovered my finger over the call button. But then, I stopped. Margaret had been planning this for months. She had crafted an entire exit strategy, and that meant she was still ahead of me. If I confronted her now, she would have an excuse ready. A story. A well-rehearsed explanation about how this was all a misunderstanding. No, I wasn't going to give her the advantage. Margaret wanted to get rid of me quietly? Fine. I'd let her think she was winning. For now. But I was going to turn this game around. Margaret thought she was directing this whole thing. She had the script, the actors, the set design. She even had the moving crew lined up to remove the unwanted character, me, from the story. The only problem? She forgot to tell me I was being written out. That was her first mistake. Her second mistake? Assuming I'd just go along with it. I wasn't going to storm into the house, demand an explanation, and give her the dramatic confrontation she had undoubtedly prepared for. No, that's exactly what she was expecting. I could already imagine her fake look of shock, her perfectly crafted speech about how this wasn't what it looked like, and we were growing apart, and I was going to love my new place. I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Margaret wanted me gone quietly? Fine. But first, I was going to make her regret every second of this. The first thing I did was call the leasing office listed on that contract she had so kindly prepared for me. A woman named Lisa answered. "Hi, Lisa," I said, trying to sound as much like a guy excited about his new apartment as possible. I was just reviewing my lease, and I had a quick question. Of course. What can I help you with? Yeah, so I was wondering, since I haven't moved in yet, is it too late to make some changes? There was a pause. Changes? Yeah, paint colors, appliance upgrades, extra keys, maybe even a second tenant on the lease? Lisa hesitated. Well, technically, since the lease starts next week, you do have time to make modifications. What did you have in mind? I grinned. Oh, Lisa. So many things. 30 minutes later, my apartment, Margaret's carefully chosen backup plan for me, had become completely unrecognizable. New paint? Bright orange. Appliance upgrades? Industrial kitchen setup. I don't even cook, but Margaret hates large appliances. Extra keys? I ordered 10. And that second tenant? Oh, you bet I added one. Because who better to move in with me than the most chaotic person I knew? My cousin, Kyle. Now, let me tell you something about Kyle. He's not a bad guy, but he's the human equivalent of an explosion in a hardware store. Loud, unpredictable, and allergic to structure. The last time he rented an apartment, he got banned from the entire complex for installing a homemade zipline between balconies. Margaret hates Kyle. So naturally, he was the perfect roommate. After finalizing the apartment sabotage, I moved on to step 2. The movers were scheduled to bring my stuff to the apartment next Tuesday, which meant I had a whole week to make sure Margaret's plan completely collapsed before then. So I made another call. This time, to our bank. Hi, I need to put a temporary hold on all joint accounts. The woman on the other end of the line paused. All of them? Yep, every single one. May I ask why? You may, but the answer will make you uncomfortable. She didn't ask. She just processed it. Margaret had planned everything, except for the part where I'd cut off access to our money. No funds? No movers. No movers? No secret eviction. I spent the rest of the evening securing the rest of my assets. I removed my name from our utilities, which were now in her name only. I changed my direct deposit account, so my paycheck wouldn't go into our account anymore. I even redirected all my mail to Kyle's address, just to make sure I wasn't missing anything important. By the time I was done, Margaret's entire clean breakup strategy had turned into a slow-moving disaster. She had no money, no way to move my stuff, and no explanation for why I hadn't reacted yet. And the best part? She still had no idea that I knew. By Friday, I was starting to wonder how long she was going to keep up the act. She still texted me like nothing was wrong. Still called to check in from her conference. Still pretended she was coming home on Sunday like a good, faithful wife. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. But then, something amazing happened. Margaret cracked first. She came home a day early. I was in the living room, casually watching TV, when I heard the front door open. I turned just in time to see her face drop. She wasn't expecting me to be here. She wasn't expecting me at all. "David," she said, her voice a little too high-pitched. "I thought you had a late meeting today." I stretched. pretending to yawn. Nope. Got done early. Decided to spend the night in my own house. Crazy, right? I could see the calculations happening behind her eyes. She forced a smile. That's great. Oh, Margaret, you were so bad at this. I stood up, stretched again, and gave her my best casual husband look. So, how was Chicago? She hesitated. Way too long. Then she smiled. Way too forced. Oh, you know. Long days, lots of networking. I nodded. Yeah? Must have been exhausting. You were so busy you didn't even have time to check the bank, huh? Her smile froze. And that's when she knew. I knew. I let the silence drag out, just long enough for her to sweat. Then I smiled. Welcome home, Margaret. Margaret stood in the doorway like someone who had just walked into an intervention they didn't know was scheduled. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, trying to figure out how much I knew. I wasn't going to make it easy for her. Long days and networking, huh? I repeated, watching her closely. Must have been really productive. You were so busy you didn't even check the bank, right? Her expression twitched. Just for a second. But that was all I needed. She knew. And I knew she knew. But instead of reacting, she forced out a laugh. The kind people do when they want to seem casual but just sound deeply uncomfortable. Well, you know how it is at these things, she said, setting her purse down with the kind of deliberate slowness that screamed, Don't panic, Margaret. Just act normal. Back-to-back meetings, barely any time to eat, let alone check the bank. I nodded, like this was the most reasonable thing in the world. Right. Totally understandable. She smiled, relieved. Then I added, especially when you were never in Chicago. The color drained from her face so fast I thought she might actually pass out. What? I tilted my head. You heard me. She opened her mouth, closed it, then forced a smile like she had just swallowed something sour. David, I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, sure you do. I sat back down, gesturing toward the couch. Come on, have a seat. I think we should talk. Margaret hesitated, probably weighing her options. She could keep pretending. She could fake outrage. She could pull some dramatic, victimized performance about how I was being paranoid and how this was all some huge misunderstanding. But I had given her no details. She didn't know what I knew, and that terrified her. Slowly, she walked over and sat across from me, carefully smoothing out her skirt like this was a normal Tuesday evening conversation. David, she started, keeping her voice calm. I don't know where this is coming from, but if you're feeling insecure about something, we can talk about it. I actually laughed. Oh, trust me, we're definitely going to talk about it. Her eyes flickered toward her purse, where her phone was. She was probably debating who to call for backup. Vincent? A lawyer? The moving company she had already paid? I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the lease agreement. The moment she saw it, her whole body tensed. I casually flipped through the pages. So, quick question, I said, holding it up. Did you really think I wouldn't find out that you were trying to move me out of my own house? Margaret froze. Then, she tried to recover. David, I held up a hand. Nope, don't even start. I want to hear this. What's the plan, Margaret? You thought I'd come home one day, find all my stuff gone, and just quietly accept that I suddenly lived somewhere else? She swallowed. Hard. It's not like that. Oh. I leaned back. Because from where I'm sitting, it sure looks like you tried to have me evicted from my own marriage without telling me. She exhaled, rubbing her temple like she was the victim in this. David, please. Let's just talk like adults. I would love to, I said cheerfully. So go ahead. Explain it to me. Margaret hesitated. Then, she made her next big mistake. She went with denial. David, you're blowing this out of proportion, she said, trying to sound reasonable. That lease isn't what you think it is. I stared at her. Oh, really? Because it has my name on it, a paid deposit, and an address I've never even been to. Margaret folded her arms. Fine. You want the truth? I gestured for her to go ahead. I was trying to help you, she said, suddenly looking offended. You've been under so much stress lately. I thought having a separate space would give you some clarity. I actually burst out laughing. A separate space? Margaret, You weren't giving me a vacation home. You were moving me out. She shook her head. All fake disappointment. David, you're always so paranoid. This is why I didn't tell you. Oh, yeah, I said, nodding. That makes sense. Totally normal to secretly lease an apartment for your husband without telling him. She exhaled sharply, clearly realizing this wasn't working. I didn't tell you because I knew you'd react like this. I clapped my hands together. Well, congratulations, Margaret. Your instincts were spot on. She scowled. You're being impossible. And you're being a terrible liar, I shot back. So, why don't we speed this up? Who's Vincent Holloway, and why is he paying to move me out of my own house? There it was. That tiny flinch. The kind people make when they hear a name they really didn't expect you to know. She recovered quickly, but I saw it. David, I don't know what you've convinced yourself of, but you need to calm down. Oh, I'm calm, I assured her. I'm so calm that I already had all the joint accounts frozen. Margaret's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Yeah, I continued. Turns out, when your spouse is trying to financially erase you, banks get real interested. Her face twisted. David, you had no right to. No right? I cut her off, laughing. Margaret, you were literally removing me from my own home. And you have the audacity to talk about rights? She was silent. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. I'm going to ask you one last time. Who is Vincent Holloway? Margaret looked away. And that's when I knew. I was about to hear something worse than an affair. Margaret sat there, avoiding eye contact like a kid caught with a failing report card. That was already an answer in itself, but I wanted to hear her say it. Who, I repeated, is Vincent Holloway? She exhaled through her nose, tapping her fingers against her knee. David, listen. I interrupted, and it's been incredibly entertaining. But I'd like you to get to the part where you explain why a total stranger has more control over my living situation than I do. Silence. She wasn't going to give it up easily, which meant I'd have to pull it out of her piece by piece. Fine. You weren't in Chicago, I began, listing the facts. You were at his house, moving my stuff into his house, using his money to try and get rid of me. You leased me an apartment behind my back and hoped I wouldn't notice until it was too late. I leaned forward. So tell me, Margaret, who is he? She let out a sharp laugh, but not the kind that comes from something funny. This was the I've already lost, but I still need to pretend I have some control kind of laugh. And then she said it. He's my husband. It took a full 5 seconds for my brain to catch up. I blinked. I'm sorry. He's your what? She finally met my eyes. Husband. For the first time in this entire mess, I had nothing to say. Margaret sighed like this was inconvenient for her. I married him before I met you. There are a lot of things I expected to hear that night. This wasn't one of them. I laughed. Because what else was I supposed to do? Margaret, you forgot to get divorced? She winced. It's complicated. Is it? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Because it sounds pretty straightforward. She shifted in her seat, suddenly very interested in the floor. He was supposed to handle it, she muttered. I tilted my head. Oh, he was supposed to handle it? What a great legal strategy. Hi, honey, could you take care of that small paperwork issue where we stop being married? David, stop. No, really, walk me through this. I was grinning now, because this was incredible. At what point did you figure out you were committing fraud? Before or after we got married? Margaret rubbed her temples. David, it wasn't like that. Wasn't it? I gestured between us. You realize that makes this entire marriage a joke, right? You're a fraud. She groaned. Vincent was supposed to finalize the divorce years ago. I thought it was done. Really? I crossed my arms. And when exactly did you realize it wasn't? More silence. And then, it hit me. I leaned back, shaking my head. Oh my God. You didn't even find out until recently, did you? Margaret inhaled sharply. David, that's why you were so desperate to get rid of me. I laughed. You didn't know until he told you. That was it. That was the answer. Margaret had no idea she was still legally married until Vincent came back into her life. Maybe he reached out. Maybe she needed to contact him for some reason. But that's when she found out. And instead of telling me, Instead of fixing it, she tried to erase me before I noticed. Unbelievable. I whistled. Wow. Margaret, this is next level stupid. She glared at me. You don't get it. Oh, I do. I shot back. You realized you were still married to a millionaire, panicked, and thought, hey, let me quietly ship my current husband out of the picture so I can pretend this never happened. It's not like that. Then explain it. Margaret didn't, because there was nothing she could say that would make this better. So, tell me, I continued, fully enjoying myself now. Were you planning to marry me again after you got rid of me? Or was this just your way of handling past mistakes? She rolled her eyes. I was trying to make things easier for everyone. Everyone? I pointed at myself. Did you mean me? Margaret waved a hand. You would have been fine. I stared at her. Oh. Margaret, I didn't realize I was dealing with someone so generous. David, don't be dramatic. I rubbed my chin. Right. How selfish of me to feel anything about being tricked into a fake marriage and nearly evicted from my own home. You're right. I should be thanking you. Are you done? I exhaled, standing up. Yeah, I think I am. Margaret straightened up. Good. Now we can talk like adults. I laughed. Margaret, you lost that privilege. She sighed. So what now? Are you gonna make this difficult? I turned toward the hallway. Nope. Margaret blinked. Wait, what are you? I held up my phone. The call timer was still running. Margaret's face dropped. You know what's great about having a cousin who works in legal services? I said, grinning. They can listen to entire conversations and tell you exactly how much legal trouble someone is in. Margaret's jaw clenched. David, don't do this. Oh, I'm doing this. I turned the volume up. Yeah, David? Kyle's voice came through loud and clear. That was a real fun listen. Margaret's mouth fell open. Kyle chuckled. So, here's the deal. Margaret? You're in trouble. Margaret looked like she wanted to throw something. You have no right. Oh, I have every right, I cut in. And since our marriage was never real, that means you don't get to take anything from me. Kyle chimed back in. And considering you knowingly let David enter a false marriage, there's a lot of legal ground to mess with you. Margaret stood up, furious. David, you don't want to do this. I laughed. Margaret, you already did this. She clenched her fists. Fine. What do you want? I thought for a moment. Then I smiled. I want you to walk away. Margaret narrowed her eyes. Walk away from what? I pointed around. All of this. The house? Mine. The accounts? Mine. The car? Mine. You get nothing. She stared at me. You wouldn't. I raised an eyebrow. Wouldn't I? Margaret's face twisted. You want me to just leave? I grinned. Yes, Margaret. Like you were planning for me. She opened her mouth, then closed it. She had nothing. I grabbed my keys and walked past her. Get your stuff and go. Margaret didn't move. Now, Margaret. For the first time, she looked panicked. But there was nothing left for her to say. So she did the only thing she could. She left. And that was the last time I ever saw Margaret. The end. Thanks for watching. Rate the story in the comments. Subscribe to the channel